Hello and welcome to Vision Denial and Day 6 of Worlds. My name is Sam, and if you're new here, I've watched every single playoff series of 2022. All of the summer ones, yes, all 383 games, yes, including that one. And we're just doing reviews of every day of Worlds. So for any of you who don't know, I take all of these games. I'm just going to do a quick review of them and then take into my thoughts afterwards. We've got two teams that we say goodbye to. We say goodbye to Mad Lions again, and we say goodbye to Detonation Focus Me. Spoilers ahead, but if you're watching one of these videos, you're probably looking for a spoiler or some thoughts. Who knows? We also have some interesting takes in terms of champions so far played. Just overall, which is interesting. We also know who the groups are. It was really fun. We got some cool stuff to look over. And without further ado, also, I'll be putting a lot of these reviews onto TikTok down below. Not necessarily right after the series themselves happen, but usually before I upload these videos. So, link to that in the comments down below. Without further ado, let's go through the reviews of today's series. Our first series of the day was Evil Geniuses, the LCS's 3rd seed, versus Mad Lions, the LEC's 4th seed. And my goodness, Mad Lions does not have luck with the play-in stage. Now, most people thought this would happen. Wouldn't happen. Not from a historical standpoint, stats standpoint, eyeball test standpoint. Evil Geniuses recognized Mad Lions' issues, banned it out, and it was clear Mad Lions had one strategy to really get the early game going. And if that draft, specifically the Belveth, was not selected, then they reverted back to a fairly passive Mad Lions. Evil Geniuses, for their part, weren't that much more active in the early to mid game. All that mattered was that they drafted for a style that really emphasized their ability to be proactive in the mid to late game stages. Otherwise, vision, neutral setup, team fighting even, are fairly even for both sides of this particular matchup. The one thing that Evil Geniuses had was just they were more proactive overall after recognizing the lack of preparation that Mad Lions had in this series. And it was subtle. A lot of more in terms of setup for traps and creating scenarios that forced mistakes out of Mad Lions and always allowed Evil Geniuses to trade up. Fantastic stuff, and really excited to see how they adapt further into every world stage. Unfortunate for Mad Lions, who, even though they dispelled some of their critics in the previous series, the issues still plagued them to this particular one. And it was clear to this day that maybe a team that was winning more best of fives in the playoffs would have probably been better. My MVP for this series is Inspired, who really did everything to guarantee Elioya was second to the play and accelerated his laners. Our second series of the day was Royal Never Give Up, the LPL's 4th seed, versus LJL's number 1 representative, Detonation Focus Me. The first game of this series exemplified what I expected. Detonation Focus Me understands how to approach the late game, and as the Royals fumble at that part specifically, and their consistency for the early to mid game really wasn't there in the early game, we wind up seeing them lose full control and not come back. We almost got the same thing in game 2, but Detonation Focus Me still play with rather questionable macro decisions overall, and throw away a large lead that should have been theirs. There is a world in which Detonation Focus Me goes 3-0, and we have 2 historical events happening today. But instead, this was the most likely event regardless of how it happened. I do think that both sides had very inconsistent vision, but that the team fights were so close and at their limits that it could have gone either way in many of these stages. This was a series of who could get side lane control and split their opponents, and both Breve and Evie succeeded in those endeavors, mostly relying, and it really mattered, on how the bottom side of the map would progress and if it would match the top side at all. We say goodbye to Detonation Focus Me, who continue to impress on the international stage, but whose flaws shine through at the worst times, and yet still shone a spotlight on the strengths and weaknesses of Royals. Now, Royal Never Give Up, for their part, will be joining a rather difficult group for themselves, who will be more than happy to match their style and improve upon it even. My MVP for the series is Breathe, who, and again, as mentioned, the top lane being such a pivotal point of this series, his pressure on the top side was the make or break point for Royal Never Give Up. And that's the end of play-ins. Play-ins was a lot more exciting this year than in previous years. There's a lot to say about the improvement from the emerging regions just in general. There's a lot to say about the consistency of the Japanese region, how Beyond Gaming really dropped the ball and no one really noticed or paid attention. A team really flew under the radar in terms of criticism or even any note. And it all comes down really to the idea of what should we be expecting from these teams who go through play-ins? How are we actually seeding these teams to be going there, right? I can imagine a situation where, if we had an extra group, or if every group had one extra team in it, we wouldn't be disappointed with some of the other teams. We wouldn't be disappointed with Mad, Detonation Focus Me, Loud even. Heck, put Saigon Buffaloes. Having those 4 teams, being an extra one of the teams, could have made for some very interesting groups in and of itself. The fact that we're limiting our particular format to exist as it is really baffling to me. And I really hope that Riot actually goes and changes the format of Worlds. They've so easily, every 2 to 3 years, changed the formats of every league, it seems, either individually within their own regions or as a global sweep. They do it regularly for Europe and North America, and it would not surprise me that at this point we get another change in terms of the format for next year. So why not? Why this discussion happens every time. I'm almost 100% certain that if we had all 4 of those teams going into the next round alongside the 4 that we got, people would be ecstatic to see how they handle things. Now, whether or not they would actually compete is a whole other question, but they competed against the 4th seed, against these 4 teams that did qualify. And just by that alone, if we're expecting those 4 teams to still compete against them, transitive properties is a loose way to actually create a logic here, but I can imagine they would still find angles that would be really interesting on their approach. More interregional competition and more interregional games is what Worlds is all about. Otherwise, we're going to end up with the same kind of situation where it's always going to be the same regions that face off against each other. And that seems so disappointing, especially since we had 2 groups of 6. Larger group numbers is not an issue, it seems. So why is it not happening? The other thing I want to note here is that we are well on track to possibly beating the record of last year. Maybe. It really depends if this stagnates or if there's another shift, as it usually happens. There's usually a shift between play-ins to groups and then groups to bracket stage. But we'll see, as we've gotten 90 champions across this 46 games that we've seen, or contested specifically with a picker ban that's been put through. And Aatrox is no longer 100% pick ban, which is wild. I thought I was really going to get into group stages and be 100% pick ban. But those are my thoughts. Let's take a look actually at the groups now, because I got some thoughts, and we'll go together through my pick'ems at least. Okay, so let's start with Group A. So I've already set them up here to what I initially, my first gut instinct was to put. And personally speaking, this seems to be the format for me. And I'm just going to go through my thought process. And if I change my mind as I seek out my thought process, then cool. We have Edward Gaming I put in first place, primarily from their aggression, their consistent aggression to be specific, as well as their ability to really find angles and punish teams who are inconsistent within any particular parts of their approach. They are really good at playing around the late game, which seems to be a make or break factor for many of these teams, especially these three. They T1 has an inability to play late game in ways that they can like consistently hold control. They usually play off of their early game and really hold the pacing from there on out and tries to close out games very quickly. If it gets too late into the game, then T1 tend to lose focus more and more. Cloud9 is fairly new in terms of the of their improvement. Let's say they've had a quick, rapid improvement during their playoffs, and their particular style here didn't lead me to believe like they had a really strong identity in any way, shape, or form. Nor did I actually get the impression that they were just consistent in terms of like playing on autopilot almost. So I don't expect very big things out of them, and I don't see them being able to be beating either Edward Game or T1. And in fact, I hesitated to even put them above Fnatic. Heck, I actually, saying it out loud at this point, I would put Fnatic above them, mostly because I think Fnatic can possibly contest against either of these two teams from alone how they do control the early game. They are stylistically the most similar to the way that T1 plays, with the biggest difference here is that T1 is a very non-bloody team versus Fnatic, who is. And, oh man, I actually hesitate to put Fnatic in either way. I have a hard time with this group. This is the closest group where I think Cloud9 has just a peg below all of them. Fnatic and T1 I could switch between either, and I think Edward Gaming has a leg up on either team. Now, this is mostly on a best of one format, double round robin, of course. But for me, just from the fact that like there is an inconsistency that exists between both Fnatic and T1, that they can get caught out in the ways that they do, and that Cloud9's consistencies are still just a cut below every other team, makes me think that Cloud9 is probably going to wind up last, that Edward Gaming would probably end up first, and then you could just flip a coin here for me. But I have a feeling that the clutch factor of T1 is likely going to come through. So that's my immediate thought process. And like taking a look at the data that's from their playoff time starts to become less and less relevant as time moves on, especially since we now have data within Fnatic about how they would play already within this meta, and we don't have for the rest of the three. So we're really working off of not full speculation. This is mostly educated predictions. So then let's take a look at the next one. Heading off now towards Group B. Group B, this one I feel is fairly self-explanatory. JD Gaming is the number one LPL seed, and they are the number one LPL seed strictly from their ability to keep tempo up, to have a strong late game approach, but also never letting their opponents take any slight advantage at any given point. They contested strongly against top esports twice on in best of fives, going all the way to 5 games, and both of the teams would go back and forth between either being very strong in the early game or strong in the late game, always going back and forth in the sense of like having an identity that is fluid. If need be, they will take control in the early game, or they will contest you on every given spot in the late game. For G2, we've got a similar kind of process here, but it's mostly that their tempo is so high at any given point that they literally don't ever give you the time to control things. And they are I think, the strongest early game macro team, really putting an emphasis on how to approach every single turret plate, lane, neutral objective, in a way that maximizes their win conditions against specific teams. There's a fluidity to that, and I do think that because of it, and because they also have like a pretty decent late game approach, that Damwon Kia cannot face off against these top two teams. Now there's a chance here. Damwon tends to be fairly consistent and solid. There is every single time that they have qualified, they have made it to the bracket stage. But this year, oh boy, Damwon Kia frustrates me every year. And beforehand, it was a quirk. Like, it was a feature of the way that they played. Incredible early game, non-stop aggression. They finished the games early, quick, and if only they got past 21 minutes, that they lose. Here's the problem: is that the feature or quirk where they get past 21 minutes, they lose, is now just part of who they are, and their early game consistency and aggression is just not there anymore. They have an ability to do so. We've seen it. They were able to pull it off during the regional finals and even parts of the playoff, but it's not consistent. In fact, it is rather sloppy. And I could go back and forth between these two, but I do think that they're way stronger in terms of laners overall. But it would not surprise me if these two teams tied at all. Evil Geniuses coming in has shown us that they can catch people by surprise. And so if they catch us by surprise again, great. I love it. I love comeback stories. But I do hesitate on the idea that they will be able to compete with the early game aggression of JD Gaming and G2 and their late game approach at really ballooning the leads when Evil Geniuses still haven't shown that they can play an early game. Out of the four teams here, they're the only non-early game team. They just passively wait to see, like, unless they have a strategy for drafting to nullify all of their early games, I don't think it's going to happen. These three teams are not dependent on certain picks to do so. So Group B to me is a fairly open and shut case from that point. Let's take a look at Group C. Group C, for me, is super interesting. In which Group A was difficult because they're all having their particular flaws. Group C are a bunch of teams with question marks about their consistency and what their actual highest highs and lowest lows are. Top Esports were the favorites of the LPL playoffs, or at least one of them. To me, they were the favorites. And I find myself really struggling with putting them first when I could have done this, heck, even this. And I mention this primarily because for Rogue and DRX here is questions about like their recent performances versus what could be their current high. For Game Esports here, it's mostly from the fact that they had a slump in their summer, a very slight slump, but a slump nonetheless, and their highs are so good that I could see them going all the way. And I'm personally biased towards the Vietnamese region as being one of the best ones to catch people off guard, and GAM especially is the most consistent, having game plans for early game, mid game, and late game, and an aggression that is very hard to play off against. And while Top Esports, like I mentioned, against their play with JD Gaming, have an equal flexibility in terms of either playing the early game when they need to play the early game or playing the late game when they need to play the late game, their positional errors really irk me sometimes. On moments where it seems very clear they would win games, goodness gracious, One person steps out of line, just one, and it's gone. But out of the four teams here, this is the only one that doesn't have like a huge dip in their quality randomly. Rogue, I don't have much confidence in. As much as the finals in the European LEC was hype, they didn't show me the same kind of consistency that G2 has. And to me, I think it's just that's a flip switch, or a switch flipped in their heads, and they were able to perform all of a sudden. And I don't think they'll be able to reflect that here. And for DRX, I think it's the same kind of thing. A switch flipped into their head, especially for play-ins where they didn't want to get knocked out. But I struggle to really think that DRX is going to do better. I could switch between these two back and forth, and oh god, no. I do think that Rogue at least has a little bit more consistency. There is an ability from theirs that an ability of theirs to really notice like where to attack their opponents and where to like really hit them where it hurts. And DRX is still fairly. There's that one game against Mad that really is resonating with me. And if they keep picking Pioshik over Juhan and they don't have that early game aggression, or they keep, even with Juhan, if they don't have that early game aggression, I can see them being eaten alive. So yeah, I'll put DRX fourth here. I don't expect these two teams to go. I could have put GAM in last and then switch between these two. For me, the only real consistency is top. Top for me, I know, is for almost a fact going first. The rest of these, you could flip and make an argument for any of them. I just think that GAM is much more consistent and has had higher highs for the longest with less dips in their quality of play versus Rogue and DRX, who have a lot more question marks around them. Let's take a look at the next group, Group D. We head off to Group D, and Group D should be very clear as to what is going on. You put Gen G first, flip a coin anywhere else. Straight up anywhere else. The Royals, for me, great. Awesome team. They had a okay performance qualifying here. It would have not surprised me if instead here we would have gotten a Detonation Focus Me, if only they performed slightly better. That said, the same thing could be said about the Flying Oysters and 100 Thieves, who, oh boy, I'm not a fan of the playstyle for the 100 Thieves, and I love the way that the Flying Oysters play, but they're usually flying off the rails or flying off the handles. This, just like Group C, it's very obvious who the first one should be. Gen G is the scariest team going into Worlds, at least stat-wise and eyeball test-wise. Chovy is on a roll. You should be fearing everyone on this team. I cannot state how hard, like, if I see anybody put anybody else other than Gen G on top, you're fooling yourself. Every one of these other teams here, you could make an argument for making up. I have more hesitancy to put Royals here, right? I have more confidence in Fnatic making it out. Or, heck, I have more confidence in DRX making it out than the Royals. And that's mostly just from the fact that because of their lack of late game play, and that their early game play, if it was even consistent, it would be a lot stronger of a chance. I would go with them, but they don't have that same consistency with their early game that they had from the regular season. And without that, I default to the Flying Oysters, who on paper have been performing significantly better than the 100 Thieves. And while 100 Thieves have had a technically stronger season in the summer, part of me is just wondering how much do the Thieves actually have prepared. They have not struck me as a confident team for North America. None of them have. None of the North American teams have. And that's why I don't have any of them going through to groups. But if they surprise me, I could see an argument for either of these two going out. But I have more confidence in the PCS's representative in the Flying Oysters going through, just by their performance numbers. It is If I was just to compare them right now, just one by one. Wait. Oh yeah, no. Even just by the numbers, it is night and day between the two. 100%. I, I like these two switching spots. To me, it's the Group D is definitely Flying Oysters and Gen G. It's not even a contest at this point. And that's pretty much where I stand on this. This is the scariest team. This is the most consistent team out of out of the bottom three, and it's battle of pride from there on out. From that, those are my particular thoughts on the situation. That's what my particular pick'ems at least looks like. Um, it is mostly from an argumentative standpoint. You could go at it in a bunch of different angles. If you think that the recency and the way that we've seen some of these teams play during play-ins has a lot of effect on what we can expect from the other teams, 100% go for that. There's Worlds is always surprising in terms of the fact of whichever team is better adapting or better at adapting to the new meta, is better at creating a different set of styles that are not expected or able to dodge particular like preparations. And some teams just come out of nowhere, just unlocked, right? I'm thinking of like Cloud9 from 2018 that all of a sudden just makes it to semifinal somehow, beats two Korean teams unexpectedly. Situations like that, or I'm thinking even further back, really old. We're thinking about like the Taipei Assassins, who out of nowhere just this random GPL team from Southeast Asia just comes in and it's just like, oh yeah, we're total underdogs. No one should take us seriously, and wins the whole dang thing. It's understandable to like take any angle and point of view from something and really run with it. So like by all means, disagree with me. I want to hear everyone's like thought process from this. I, however, take a look at the particular performances, even the recent ones and the older ones, and lean into the fact that these teams are likely to stay competitive with one another, but have also stayed somewhat consistent with how they approach things. Like for DRX, for example, picking Pyoshik, those are the games that they are the worst looking in. But with Juhan, they look fantastic, almost flawless. And if they keep really relying on Pyoshik, I can see them never getting out of groups. And considering that, historically speaking, that's who they've been sticking with, I don't expect them to make that decision to change consistently anytime soon. And same thing with Royals, who having a pretty solid season up until the playoffs showed on the playoff stage over and over and over again. They had a problem with their consistency in early game, and their late game was even worse. And that they made it just by the skin of their teeth, just barely. So, as much as some of the predictions may be, slightly predictable in some sense, there is precedent for how I actually set things up. Now, you could argue T1 could be above Edward Gaming. I'm still very iffy on how consistent the performances from T1 are going to be going into the international stage. I do think they will be clean. I just think that Edward Gaming's aggression is going to be better. And with the other groups, the ones that with JDG, Top, and Gen G, those tops are fairly, to me, fairly obvious. So I want to see what everybody's arguments are. I really want to see. I want to see what's going on. Like, what does everybody think is the most likely scenario? Leave your comments down below with any particular argument. I'm super excited to see whether or not there's going to be another meta shift. I have a feeling there might be another meta shift, but this world has already been way more interesting than the others. So we'll see if there is even one, or if there's such an extreme change. I don't have much more to bookend other than an appreciation, at least for the 8 teams that have been disqualified. A third of the teams are gone. A third of the tournament is done. And there is an appreciation for just how awesome this year has been. I had some fears and concerns about how competitive this year was going to be. In years usually where things are super competitive, it's because there's usually one-sided stomps from their individual regions, and all of them come in really booking it out, having to face off against teams who also didn't have much competition, and so it's really rough and tumble. And when there's a lot of close competition between regions, it tends to be one-sided. A lot of the teams know exactly how to deal with things, and so one team is on locked super easily. And now I don't have that feeling that we're going to have a very one-sided affair. I'm still fairly confident Gen G is going to win the whole thing, but I don't think it's going to be super one-sided. No, not super one-sided. But those are my thoughts from my long rambly going on. Like I said, anything in the comments below, let me know what you think. Do you think that we're going to keep seeing super huge competition, change the meta at all? I'd love to hear everything down below, all of it. And again, thank you for watching. I appreciate everybody who does and takes the time to comment and let me know interesting facts about the regions or what they are expecting. And if you like this kind of content, like and subscribe. I've got other videos on the sides here regarding the other teams that have qualified and all of the other videos that I've made so far. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time for the first day of groups. We're already at groups.